Welcome back to the Answer Series Diagnostic Report teaching and learning tool for the NSC November examination. This is an all-in-one tool that combines the November NSC paper, Memoranda, and annual Diagnostic Report commentary to create a comprehensive teaching and learning experience. TAS provides this document for free, and we encourage teachers, learners, tutors, and subject advisors to use it. All we ask is that you please give credit where credit is due and not change or alter any content in this document that removes our name from it. Moving on to Section B with question 2.1 on the female reproductive system. So question 2.1, identify part A, which is this fallopian tube that runs from the uterus to the ovary, which is then B, this structure here. The diagnostic report mentions that candidates incorrectly identified this structure, namely the ovary, as a Graafian follicle. So please note that this is showing the entire structure, whereas the Graafian follicle would have been something inside of B. Question 2.1.2, give two characteristics of the endometrium that make it suitable for implantation. So the marking guideline provided marks for a rich blood supply, or the fact that it's glandular, and the fact that it is thick, which means that there's a nice thick layer to actually embed into. And you only had to provide two of these, so any two of these would have been considered correct options. And question B asks for two visible reasons why there is an increased chance of fertilization in this female. So you have to actually look at this picture. So the marks were allocated for saying that sperm cells are actually present in the fallopian tube. I mean, she wouldn't be able to get a fertilized egg if there were no sperm cells available, and there's no blockage there, so you can see the sperm cells moving towards the egg. And obviously ovulation has taken place. The egg cell is available, the ovum is available to be fertilized. If this was an earlier stage in her cycle, she would have this Graafian follicle still inside the ovary, and even if there were sperm cells, they wouldn't be able to fertilize it. So those are the only two real visible reasons for fertilization to take place. The diagnostic report says that candidates incorrectly stated that there were many sperm in the fallopian tube when there are actually only a few of them present. If you look at the number of sperm available here compared to here, there are definitely not many sperm in the fallopian tube. So the answer was concerned with the proximity or closeness of the sperm to the ovum and not actually the number of sperm. The question then continued. Identify and describe the type of gametogenesis that leads to the formation of structure C, that is the ovum. So the type of gametogenesis is oogenesis. The memorandum here follows the exact format of the exam guideline, so this is really a question that you should get 6 out of 6 marks for. Just note that there's a compulsory mark for saying that this is oogenesis because the type of gametogenesis is not specified in the question. Diagnostic report mentions that candidates left out key words in their description, which is very sad because, again, this is like a copy and paste out of the exam guideline. Instead of saying diploid cells in the ovary undergo mitosis, they only said cells undergo mitosis. Instead of saying that one cell inside a follicle will enlarge and undergo meiosis, they say that a follicle enlarges and undergoes meiosis, but it's inside. It's the cell inside the follicle. And instead of saying that 4 cells are produced, one of which will become an ovum, they just said that this process occurs to produce an ovum. Question 2.1.4, an ectopic pregnancy. The fertilized ovum can become implanted in A, the fallopian tube. This normally results in the death of an embryo and may endanger the mother's life. Explain why an ectopic pregnancy may result in the death of an embryo. So the fallopian tube, part A, could have gotten a mark by just saying that it's not really a big enough space. It doesn't provide enough space for the developing fetus. There's no endometrium for implantation to occur. There's not enough blood supply for nutrients to be provided or oxygen or to remove waste products. So the embryo cannot develop in that space, and you could have gotten any of those 3 marks. The diagnostic report just mentions that candidates could not present their answers in a cause and effect way, and we have provided some revision to practice this. So cause and effect questions are usually explain questions, which are very typical in life sciences exams. These types of questions can either be based on pre-knowledge that you need to apply to an unknown context, similar to what we just looked at, and we've given you 2 examples of that we'll work through, or it can be based on content that's been provided in an extract, a graph, a table, or a scientific investigation, and you still need to apply your knowledge to that content as well. So the best way to approach a cause and effect question is to always think of your structuring your answer in a because of this, therefore that happens structure. And we'll look at 3 examples and include some steps to help you see this pattern. So the first example is the exact question that we just looked at in the 2024 November paper about the ectopic pregnancy and how that may result in the death of an embryo. So if you're wondering how to get to that specific memo answer, let's look at steps involved in this. So step 1 is to highlight key words implanted in the fallopian tube and explain why an ectopic pregnancy may result in the death of the embryo. Those are the 2 things you need to touch on in your answer, the cause and effect. The next step is to visualize this scenario. So this picture comes from a previous NSC paper, and you can see that this is basically what an ectopic pregnancy entails, right? A blastocyst implants in the fallopian tube and it starts to grow in that tiny area, which can obviously rupture the fallopian tube and cause a lot of damage to the female reproductive system. And it's very clear, if you visualize it, that that space is not big enough for a developing fetus, and it also doesn't provide the thick endometrium, the blood supply, etc. required to sustain that developing fetus. Step 3 is to consider the normal scenario, what you have actually learned. So this is not something you would write. This is just you considering, where does implantation normally occur and why does it have to occur there? So normally fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes. This fertilized ovum or developing embryo moves through the fallopian tube and it goes to the uterus to be implanted. That's the normal scenario. So step 4 says, why? Why is it biologically important for that normal scenario to take place? Well, because the uterus has space for a developing fetus. The uterus has a blood supply layer called the endometrium where the placenta can actually develop, and therefore it can provide this fetus with enough nutrients and oxygen to allow it to grow. The next step is now to actually structure your answer. So step 5 is where you're going to write your memo answer. You're going to contextualize unknown problems based on what you know the normal scenario would be. So the first thing is to write your introduction by saying what happens in the question. So the question tells you that a fertilized ovum can be implanted into the fallopian tube. What happens? If a fertilized ovum implanted into the fallopian tube ... You're going to explain what happens. Now, the explanation section in blue basically requires you to think of what you learned, what you know the normal scenario is, and to state the negative of it. That is very typical of a disease state or a condition or some other unknown problem that you're faced with. We teach you how a normal structure or system or organ will function, and then in an exam you get confronted with the scenario where it's not working properly or something went wrong. And you need to just think about, if it can't do its normal job, what would be the problem? So you're stating the negative of the normal. If the uterus is where it usually implants because there's a lot of space, then obviously there would not be enough space in the fallopian tube for the developing fetus. If the uterus has a rich blood supply where the placenta can develop and provide the fetus with nutrients and oxygen, then that would not be true of the fallopian tube. It does not have a blood-rich layer, and therefore placenta can't develop there, and the developing fetus would not be provided with nutrients and oxygen in order to survive. And then finally, this section which says explain why an ectopic pregnancy may result in the death of an embryo, you'd make that your final sentence to tell the marker, therefore, everything that I've said will mean that an ectopic pregnancy would result in the death of an embryo. So you can see that your structure of your answer is if this, therefore that. Because a fertilized embryo implanted into the fallopian tube, therefore, there would not be enough space. It does not have an endometrium. It would not be able to provide nutrients, and an ectopic pregnancy would result in the death of an embryo. So let's practice this with another example. This question comes from the 2016 June paper 1. Explain the consequences of reproduction if a sperm cell did not have an acrosome. So first highlight the key words. Consequences for reproduction is what you need to answer. And what is the problem? The sperm cell does not have an acrosome. If you then visualize this is what a normal sperm cell looks like. It has the acrosome at the front, whereas this question is basically asking you what would happen if the sperm cell looked like that. It doesn't have an acrosome. Step 3 and step 4. First, consider the normal scenario, what you have learned. What does a sperm cell normally have and why? A sperm cell normally does have an acrosome. Why does it need an acrosome? Because the acrosome contains enzymes. Those enzymes allow it to penetrate the ovum, and it allows fertilization to be able to occur. Step 5 is now to formulate your answer by the if this happens, therefore that context. So we start off by just saying what the question asks us, right? It tells you the consequences if a sperm cell did not have an acrosome. If no acrosome is present in a sperm cell, ... So you state the negative of the normal scenario. So we know that if a sperm cell does not have an acrosome, it will not contain enzymes. It cannot penetrate the ovum, and no fertilization can occur. You end off by answering the question, so explain the consequences for reproduction. So therefore, the male will not be able to reproduce. No reproduction will take place. He basically doesn't have effective sperm cells in order to allow for fertilization to occur. So you begin with, if this is the case, ... therefore this is going to happen, and you answer your question by stating the negative of what you've learned. Now let's look at the third and final example that gives us a question based on a context, a paragraph that has been given. So this question is from the 2016 Eastern Cape Paper 1 from September. It says several recent studies have suggested a gradual decline in sperm production in men. Endocrine disruptors as well as lifestyle have been suggested as risk factors. One lifestyle factor that may affect human fertility is driving a vehicle for a prolonged period. It is suggested that the driving position may increase the scrotal temperature. Explain why regular long-distance driving with no brakes could possibly lower the sperm count in healthy males. So step 1, highlight keywords. So in the yellow line here, we have decline in sperm production in men. That is what we need to focus on answering. Then we have the blue section, which is new because this is a contextual question. This is based on an extract, so they're giving you some background information. So in this whole paragraph, the important sentence here is hinting towards the fact that driving in a seated position increases the temperature of the testes. That's going to be something that you need to consider. It's giving you that information so that you can help formulate your answer. And in the green section is the typical having to answer the question of explaining why long distance driving without brakes could possibly lower the sperm count. So how does this affect that? Then you have to visualize the scenario. So this is just a picture of a man sitting for a long time at a car, and you can see that obviously this is going to create a problem in terms of temperature regulation with the testes being close to the body for extended periods of time. Step 3, consider the normal scenario. What have you learned about the testes and temperature in general? What does sperm production in men normally entail, and why is that important? So normally, sperm are produced in the testes. And the testes actually hang outside and away from the male body inside the scrotum. And the reason for this is because you learned that optimal temperature for normal spermatogenesis to occur is actually lower than our normal body temperature. That's why it's so important for the testes to hang away from the body. Step 4, read the content provided now for hints or obstacles to the normal scenario. So you'll notice that this step 4 is different to our previous step 4s because this is a context-based question. They're giving you an extract and they're asking you to reference the content provided. So you read the content and you look for hints and obstacles to this normal scenario, meaning normally the testes have to hang away from the body. But driving in this position increases the scrotal temperature because it's keeping the testes close to the body. Step 5 now still remains structuring your answer by contextualizing this unknown problem, disease, state, or condition based on what has been provided. So you start by saying, if this, therefore that. If males were driving for long distances in this seated position, ... You're going to state how this scenario is going to affect the normal scenario. So you see a little bit of a twist in the because this, therefore that. So sitting in this driving position for a long period of time, the testes would be squeezed close to the body, This would increase their temperature, as it has been mentioned here in the paragraph itself. And this means that the temperature of the testes will be above the optimum temperature for sperm production, which you referenced as part of your understanding of the normal scenario. So what's the consequence of this? Sperm production will decrease, or even no spermatogenesis, you might have said, would occur. It just creates this idea that there's a problem with spermatogenesis. So either fewer sperm or no sperm are going to be produced. And then you end off by answering this question. Explain why this driving in the seated position could lower the sperm count of males. So therefore, because of all of this, a male's sperm count would be lower. So you begin with, if the person sits for a long period of time, the male sits, therefore the testes are squeezed, their temperature increases, spermatogenesis is not at its optimum temperature, no or fewer sperm produced, and therefore this contributes to the lower sperm count we observe in males. So this is a good example of how to look at cause and effect questions, and you can practice this with many other questions in past exam papers. But for now, we're going to continue home. So back at question 214, that was the first example we looked at, and now you can see how they get to a memorandum answer like this. Question 2.2 continues on the theme of human reproduction. The table shows the level of 2 hormones during the menstrual cycle in a healthy human female. We're looking at estrogen and progesterone level, and the menstrual cycle is 28 days long. Question 221, on which day of this menstrual cycle is the level of progesterone the highest? So we're going to only look at the progesterone column, and we're going to literally just look at where the progesterone level is the highest in the column, so that's day 20. Name the reproductive hormone that will begin to increase from day 24 of this female's menstrual cycle. So day 24 is towards the end of the cycle, at which point, if no fertilization has occurred, the progesterone level is going to drop. As you can see, it's going down, and that's going to stop the inhibition of the pituitary hormones. Specifically, FSH is going to increase first because that is follicle stimulating hormone, so that a new cycle can start. Question 223 now basically asks us to put our reasoning to paper, right? Use the data on the table to explain how you got to that answer. How do you know FSH is actually going to be the one that increases from day 24? So the only thing we have in the table to go with is progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone is the hormone that inhibits the pituitary gland, so because it's pro-pregnancy, that's how I always think of it. Progesterone is the pro-pregnancy hormone. As long as its levels remain high, your body is hopeful of a pregnancy happening. So what we see is the drop in the progesterone levels from 5 to 0.8 nanograms per milliliter decreases its inhibition on the pituitary gland. It's no longer being inhibited by progesterone, and therefore the FSH secretion can increase. The diagnostic report says that candidates couldn't explain this. They couldn't explain that from day 24 anything to do with the progesterone level affected FSH, but rather explained the function of FSH itself. Continuing on this question of human reproduction, question 224 asks us to calculate the percentage increase in the estrogen level from day 8 to day 10. So this is a stock standard formula that you need to remember. This is also one of the things candidates do struggle with a lot. They can't calculate a percentage increase. You basically subtract the two values from one another, the 280 from the 70, and you divide it by the original value because it's increasing from 70, and then to get it to a percentage you multiply by 100, and the answer then is 300. Remember the unit percent, and this counted 3 marks because you get 1 mark for doing the calculation, 1 mark for making it a percentage times 100, and 1 mark for actually writing the correct answer. Question 225, how would the progesterone level have differed after day 20 if this woman was pregnant? Remember, progesterone is the pro-pregnancy hormone, so its levels would have remained high or would be increasing as it supports the endometrium to sustain that pregnancy. So candidates lost marks for saying that progesterone stays constant when the emphasis is on it. That will increase. Then question 226 wants you to explain what causes this change that you've mentioned. So what would lead to the progesterone level actually remaining high if the woman was pregnant? So there's one of 2 reasons. The first is that initially the corpus luteum does not disintegrate. Remember that actually secretes progesterone. So if there's a pregnancy, corpus luteum stays intact and that continues to secrete the progesterone. Alternatively, if we're talking about at a later point, after the placenta has developed, that is going to take over the function of the corpus luteum and continues to secrete progesterone, which also leads to the increase in the progesterone concentration. So candidates couldn't explain this. Instead, they explained the function of progesterone, and some of them did not link the corpus luteum not disintegrating to increasing progesterone. So it's very important that we recap the menstrual cycle in this regard. Question 2.3 has to do with the sense organs, the eye. So cataracts primarily form when protein structures in the lens of the eye start to disintegrate and clump together. Cataracts are the most common causes of blindness and also the main cause of vision loss in people over 40. Two types of cataracts occur: nuclear cataracts and subcapsular cataracts. In nuclear cataracts, they form in the central region of the lens and gradually spread outwards. And in subcapsular cataracts, they develop at the back of the lens and is more common in people with diabetes. Question 231, according to the passage, which type of cataract is associated with the disorder of the pancreas? So that would be the subcapsular cataracts, because they've mentioned diabetes, and that is a person who has an issue with insulin production in the pancreas. Then question 232 was a bit of an issue. It says use the information in the passage to explain why cataracts cause vision loss. So in the very first sentence, it says that when protein structures in the lens of the eye start to disintegrate and clump together, that tells you there's a clump forming. Note that that is also the very first sentence, because you're basically quoting from the passage, because of this, therefore, this is going to happen. So the section of this that you kind of need to figure out is basically the second part, where you're going to explain why this leads to vision loss. So the lens becomes opaque or milky or cloudy, so there's a clump in front of it. That means that less or no light is going to pass through to the retina, and no stimuli for light will be converted to impulses. So you basically go blind from the cataract. The diagnostic report says that candidates had difficulty using the information in the passage. They either gave very generic answers of what cataracts were, so they quoted from their textbooks, or they quoted whole sections of the text instead of actually contextualizing it. The answer required candidates to extract this quote, protein structures in the eye start to disintegrate and clump together, and then to explain how this leads to vision loss. They also did not know that if a lens becomes milky or cloudy or there's a clump in it of some kind, light cannot pass through to the retina. They instead incorrectly stated that light cannot enter the eye. So remember, light passes through the lens and falls on the retina. Light can still get into the eye, it's just about whether the lens can focus it onto the retina or not that makes you able to see. Then we continue with question 2.4 on the eye. A man is long-sighted. That means he can see far away. He cannot see near very clearly. He can see near, but he can't see clearly. Explain how the structure of his eyeball structure affects his vision when he reads a book without glasses. So how does this eyeball structure that allows him to see far affect his vision when he's trying to look at something close to his eyes? So the diagnostic report mentions that most candidates referred to the lens instead of how the eyeball affected the vision. And question 242 also posed a problem by learners not being able to explain how the wearing of convex lenses could improve the vision of this man when he reads a book. So the best thing to do is to revise this with an online simulation that we've included. We'll open up the simulation. You can see that it opens on normal vision, and you can also overlay an eye onto it so that learners can see what the different shapes are. So in the simplified version, you can see that the normal vision, the person is looking at an object far away. If that object moves closer to the lens, you have to change the shape of the lens for it to focus on the retina of the eye. So as an object moves closer, the lens has to become more convex to keep the light rays focused on the retina. As the object moves farther away from the eye, the lens changes shape, becomes less convex so that light rays fall on the retina. In the case of long-sightedness, now in this animation, long-sightedness is also called far-sightedness. When you click on that, you can immediately see a change in the shape of the eyeball for someone who is long-sighted. The eyeball becomes shorter. So the distance between the front and the back of the eyeball is squished, and that causes the lens to be much less convex or very flat. Now the question specifically asks learners to comment on the shape of the eye. So the eye becomes shorter, which means that when a person who is normally long-sighted looks at a nearby object, the light rays are actually falling very far behind the retina. Even if you change the shape of the lens for near, you can see that they're still not coinciding. So the image falls behind the retina, which means the image is blurry and they can't see the object that is near to their eyes very clearly. The next question, 242, also asked about the corrective lenses. So you can actually check that box as well. And it shows you that the corrective lens for a person with long-sightedness is a convex lens, because what that lens is going to do is it's going to increase the refraction of the light rays and thereby focus the image on the retina. So returning back to our question now. So the structure of the eyeball affecting vision when he reads a book without glasses. So the eyeball is going to be too short. Images fall behind the retina, creating a blurred vision. Alternatively, learners could have commented on the shape of the cornea, but they should not comment on the shape of the lens, because the question specifically asks about the structure of the eyeball. So the cornea could also have been less convex, which means that there's little refraction occurring, and again the image forms behind the retina, causing blurred vision. And then question 242 about the wearing of convex lenses that could improve this. What does the convex lens do? It increases the refraction of the light rays. More refraction occurs. The image will then form on the retina and you can actually see it. Question 2.5 concerned the nervous system. The diagram represents a neuron with a myelin sheath and a neuron without a myelin sheath, and they are not drawn to scale. So question 251 and 252 created a bit of a problem, and I think the problem occurred within the memorandum itself. Learners were first asked to identify the type of neuron that is shown, and the only correct answer was motor neuron. The diagnostic report specifically says that many candidates incorrectly stated multipolar neuron, which in actual fact should also have been accepted. Because if you look at question 252, it asks for a visible reason for the answer. So neurons are usually classified based on their structure or their function. If the question in 252 was asking for a reason based on the function of the neuron, then motor neuron would have been the only correct answer. But it's asking specifically for a visible reason, and in terms of its structure, it's actually classified as a multipolar neuron. So hopefully examiners will consider this flaw in the questioning for the future, seeing as the memo specifically provided a structural reason and not a functional reason for the classification of the neuron. And what is visible is the fact that it has many dendrites and that single long axon that runs from it. 253, describe the function of the type of neuron identified in question 251. So now it's specifically relating to the function of a motor neuron / in this case multipolar neuron, and it's responsible for transmitting impulses, specifically in the direction from the central nervous system to an effector. Learners could also have said from the interneuron in the central nervous system to the effector. Continuing with this question, 254 says to use the letters A, B, and C to indicate the direction in which the impulse moves through the neuron. And that would be in the direction of C, then A, and then towards B, because dendrites receive the stimulus, axons take them away towards the next structure. Question 255, name the disorder associated with degeneration of the myelin sheath of neurons, that is multiple sclerosis. Candidates incorrectly stated Alzheimer's disease. So a little hint to help you remember these. Look at the first letters of the word. Multiple sclerosis, MS, is caused by myelin sheath degeneration, MS, and that means that messages move slower. Alzheimer's disease is caused by amyloid plaques in the brain and leads to the atrophy, the shrinking of the brain. So MS, all links together. Multiple sclerosis, myelin sheath, messages move slower. Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaques lead to atrophy of the brain, becomes smaller. Question 2.6 continues with the nervous system. In the human body, the axons of myelinated neurons have much smaller diameters than the axons of unmyelinated neurons. The graph shows the speed of nerve impulses in myelinated neurons and unmyelinated neurons with different axon diameters. Question 261, give the axon diameter in micrometers at which an impulse moves at 20 meters per second in the myelinated and then in the unmyelinated neuron. So for the myelinated neuron, we can see that the 20 meters per second directly goes down to the 5 micrometers. And then on the unmyelinated neuron, 20 meters per second, you need to draw a line and then down to the x-axis, and you can see it gets to 800 micrometers. Question 262 asks learners to use the graphs to describe the difference in impulse speed for a myelinated compared to an unmyelinated neuron. The diagnostic report says that candidates provided numerical comparisons instead of describing the general trend. So they quoted data from the graphs but didn't explain what that meant. So if a learner said a myelinated neuron of 30 micrometers in diameter has an impulse speed of 120 meters per second, and an unmyelinated neuron of 1200 micrometers in diameter has an impulse speed of 30 meters per second. So they've taken that data directly from the graph. That will not receive any marks because it shows an examiner that the learner can read the graph, but they're not really understanding what they've read. They haven't interpreted what they've read at all. The learner is expecting the marker to make the conclusion, when in fact they should make a conclusion by describing their general trend. So if this is a learner watching, if you write that, please continue that thought by actually just making a conclusion about what that would mean. And what it means is that in an unmyelinated neuron, even if its diameter is so much more than that of the myelinated neuron, it still has a very slower impulse speed compared to that of the myelinated neuron. So the general trend here is that myelinated neurons have faster impulse speeds than unmyelinated neurons. And that's exactly what the marking guideline provided as options. You got double marks for that statement. So the impulse speed is faster in a myelinated neuron compared to an unmyelinated neuron, or slower in an unmyelinated neuron compared to a myelinated neuron. So the graphs basically show you that even for an unmyelinated neuron that is 4, 5, 6 times the diameter and size of a myelinated neuron, it still can't get close to the impulse speed of a myelinated neuron. It is much, much slower. The next question then asks, you use the graph to describe the relationship between the axon diameter and the impulse speed. So here candidates rewrote their answers from the previous question, and they gave the trend in the data instead of the relationship between these two variables. Candidates also used the phrase directly proportional, which is not accepted in life sciences. You have to describe the relationship. So remember that in any relationship, one person affects the other, and so too do the variables in a graph or in any scientific study. Describing their relationship requires you to describe how they affect each other. So you always start your answers to describe a relationship with as this happens. For example, as the axon diameter increases, the impulse speed will also increase. As more cigarettes are smoked per day, your chances of lung cancer increases. As more thyroxine is administered, average weight of a group decreases. So if we then look at this graph, what we're seeing that as the axon diameter increases, so does the impulse speed. And it's important to write it in that sequence. Axon diameter first, because that's my independent variable, and then impulse speed is the second thing that you mentioned, your dependent variable, because the independent variable affects the dependent variable. It would not make sense to say as the impulse speed increases, the axon diameter increases. You don't first develop lung cancer and then start smoking cigarettes. You smoke the cigarettes and then develop lung cancer. So it's important to have the independent variable mentioned first and then how it affects the dependent variable. And then looking at suggestions for improvement for question 2, it says use a diagram when explaining ovulation to show learners that the ovum is released from the ovary into the fallopian tubes. This will prevent learners from misidentifying the ovary as the Graafian follicle. And note that diagrams in exams may differ from the ones that we use in classrooms, so it's important to expose them to previous exam papers and other sources to see as many options for the same thing. To aid the answering of cause and effect questions, teach in this format what is the structure, what is its function, and how is that function affected when that structure is damaged. And we provided some examples of this. And then for the Afrikaans teachers, these are a list of terms that we should please stop teaching because they are not being awarded marks in exams. So rather talking about die fallopius buis en nie 'n eierleier nie, goiter en nie kropgeswelheid nie, die cochlea en nie 'n slakkehuis nie. So these are terms that do not get marks in NSC exam papers. Then learners struggle to understand how to interpret a graph or data given in a table. This has always been quite a problem. They can read off values, but they're not able to identify and explain trends in the data. So it's important to talk about that relationship between dependent and independent variable. When describing the trend in a graph, begin with the independent variable and then say how that affects the dependent variable. And then in life sciences, never describe data as being directly or indirectly proportional. These are not terms that we accept in life sciences papers. The direct proportion means an increase or decrease at a constant rate, and this is rarely the case with biological data. So we really want you to describe the relationship with words. As this one increases, that one decreases, or as this one increases, that one increases as well, etc.
If you found this video useful, give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook to stay on top of the latest TAS news and launches. So that's it for now from the Answer Series, your key to exam success.